for coming out tonight. If you don't know me, I'm Jeanette Topars. I'm the chair of the Planning Commission. And I want to extend a thank you to Matt for being here tonight. The kind of backstory as to why we're having this presentation tonight is back in the summer, the Planning Commission held an event. And the question was, what do you love about Guilford? And we heard so many responses about people speaking poetically and with a great deal of love and affection for Guilford's landscape, its fields, its trails, etc. And the obvious question to me afterwards, well, we expressed this real love for Guilford. How do we go about preserving that and making sure that it's there for future generations? And so I reached out to Matt to help give us some information about what tools are available to communities. So that's what he's going to talk about. For people on Zoom, you're being muted. When we go to the question and answer period, you'll be unmuted. That's about as much technology as I can tell you. All right, thank you, Matt.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Bachler. So I work for the Windham Regional Commission in Brattleboro. So we're one of the state regional planning commissions. We work with 27 towns here in southeastern Vermont. Some of you might be more familiar with us than others. This is one of the main things we do. We provide planning technical assistance to communities in our region. We also have a brownfields program. We do community development work. We have an energy program. We do a lot of work around natural resources, water quality testing. And so this is a presentation I've done in other communities too, that are thinking about how to preserve what they love about their communities and what tools are available to them. I want to say this is meant for informational purposes, so I'm going to go over some different examples of what communities can do. We're not saying anything is right for Guilford. These are just options for you to consider. And one thing I think is important to keep in mind is, when you're thinking about what you like about your town and what you want to keep and preserve and protect, often these conversations happen too late when development changes are occurring, and at that point it can be hard to go back and protect what you wish you had been able to protect. So I think it's important to have these conversations before things happen that disrupt your community. And I think, right now, Guilford, Southeast Vermont, we're not seeing a lot of development pressure, but I think that could change. I think our part of the state, especially proximity to Interstate 91, Western Massachusetts, it is an area that could see more development in upcoming years. So I think it's something for the community to think about and be aware of and think about what steps it may want to take. So just to give you a sense of what I'll be talking about, we'll be talking about land use regulation tools, so more the regulatory side of things, but then also other tools, community development and preservation tools that are not regulatory, that will also help a town preserve what it wants to protect. And then at the end, I just wanted to talk briefly about the role of Act 250, which is the state land use permitting process, just how that relates to local projects. And I'll try to go through this presentation relatively quickly, just so that there's plenty of time for questions, if anyone has questions. So to first talk about local land use regulation tools, so zoning regulations, probably most people have heard about zoning. This is the most common form of regulatory tool that's used by towns in Vermont to manage land use and development. So in our state, towns were first authorized by the legislature back in 1931 to develop zoning. As of now, more than 80% of Vermont towns have zoning. And that regulates the type and density of development. And I'll get into zoning in more details in a minute. Another one of the major tools for land use regulation is subdivision regulations. So this controls the pattern of development, how you take a piece of land and make it into smaller lots or parcels. And often subdivision is done hand in hand with zoning, but it can also be just on its own. And then flood hazard regulations, which are specific to special flood hazard areas that are identified by FEMA And Guilford has flood hazard regulations. You don't need zoning to have flood hazard regulations, but that is for property owners to qualify for flood insurance. That is a requirement that those flood hazard regulations are in place. But that's just another form of local land use tools. So how does zoning work? So zoning is used to regulate the location, type, and density of development through the creation of different zoning districts. And those zoning districts would cover an entire community, and they're based on, like the primary types of uses you want to see in those districts. So you might have a district that's primarily residential, or one that's primarily for conservation and forestry purposes. Some communities that have more commercial industrial uses or want to support those might have a specific district for commercial and industrial uses. There's no one right way to organize zoning, so I think it's important for communities to keep in mind that these are your local land use regulations, and you can develop them based on what your goals are or what you want to see in the community. That being said, there are requirements by the state about what you can and can't put in your zoning. So it's not to say that towns can zone any way they want. There are state statute requirements, but I think it's important to keep that in mind too, that this is really a local tool for the town if they choose to use it. There is a general organization to zoning that's followed with all bylaws, and I'll go into these in more details, but you'll have your zoning districts, which I just mentioned. There are kind of general regulations that will apply to all uses. Then there are more standard regulations, so if you have something that might cause an impact to the community, like a manufacturing plant, you might have specific standards for that. And then you need to spell out the process for how you're going to review applications, how those are going to get approved. And then you have definitions and a zoning map that corresponds with those zoning districts. So every zoning bylaw is a little different, but those are kind of the general things that are found in all zoning. So I'll walk through those. Just first looking at zoning districts. First, for zoning bylaws in the state of Vermont, they need to be consistent with your town plan. Guilford has an adopted town plan, and zoning is built off of your future land use plan, so your land use chapter in your town plan. And so for Guilford, Guilford has a future land use map, and they've developed policies for those different areas in the town that have been mapped out. And so that would be a basis for developing zoning. Like I mentioned, the zoning districts provide for different types of residential, commercial, and industrial districts, depending on what your goals are for different areas of town. This is an example of a zoning map from the town of Marlborough, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. And then in addition to those main zoning districts, you can also have overlay districts. So these are additional regulations for specific geographic areas, for floodplain areas, so flood hazard areas. If you had important agricultural soils, like I know the town of Westminster has an overlay district for agricultural areas in town that have additional requirements for what you can and can't do there, and also for natural resources areas. This is just looking at Marlborough zoning map in a little more detail. What I wanted to highlight here is Marlborough has a total of 6 zoning districts for their entire town. And it might be a little hard to see the differences in colors here, but most of the town is shaded in this light yellow color, which is rural residential. And Marlborough has focused on some specific areas in town where they've developed more additional regulations. So they have 2 small commercial areas on Route 9 that's shown in the red color. They have a specific village zoning district right around their village area. They set up an educational zoning district for the former Marlborough College campus. And then they also have agricultural and forest production in yellow and conservation priority in green. So the point of this is, in thinking about developing zoning for your town, it can feel like a lot, just trying to think about how do you divide up a community into different zoning districts. But what is common in a lot of towns in our region is to have a large area of the town zone something like rural residential that is more permissive and allows for low density residential, home occupations, some small scale commercial uses. And then to focus more on some priority areas in the community that need that additional regulatory review. So areas like a village district where there may be more concerns about the appearance of buildings, the size of properties, things like that. So there are ways to do, I kind of call it zoning light, where you don't go into as much detail and create as many zoning districts as other communities may. And I just wanted to show, this is the proposed land use map from Guilford's town plan. Just to step back and touch on that point again about how the future land use plan in your town plan can help inform zoning bylaws and the zoning map. So in Guilford's town plan, that identifies 6 different areas in town: historic villages, high density mixed use, low density mixed use, residential, agricultural resources, and conservation. And you can see, just comparing this map with the Marlborough zoning map, how a future land use map from your town plan could be the basis for land use regulations, because some of that work's already been done in the town plan process, mapping out the community and identifying different policies for those areas in town. So the next component of zoning is the regulation of different types of land uses in each district. And so in zoning, you identify uses that are permitted and uses that are conditional use. So a permitted use is something that you're allowed to do as of right. You would just need to get a building permit or a zoning permit from the town to do that. A conditional use is something that you want to see in that district, you want to encourage it, but it needs some additional review. So that's something that may have more impact on the neighborhood. And that additional review is done by either a zoning board or a development review board. And then you can include specific types of standards for certain uses. So it's very common for towns to have additional requirements for those conditional uses, so that if you're a property owner coming in, you're looking to do something that's classified as a conditional use, you know what you need to, requirements you need to meet to be able to do that. This is just an example from Brattleboro zoning bylaws from their rural district. I won't read off all these, but in their rural district, single family homes, accessory dwelling units, camps, agricultural and forestry uses, those are all permitted uses. And then conditional uses are, a bed and breakfast or inn, vet services, a greenhouse. So those are just some examples of what's permitted and what would be a conditional use with some additional requirements. And then zoning bylaws too need to provide dimensional standards. So the minimum size of properties, how much frontage you need to have on a public street, how far structures, buildings need to be set back from property lines, how tall a building can be, how many dwelling units you can have based on the amount of land you have. And this is an example from from Newfane. So this is their rural district. So they have, a minimum lot size of 2 acres. If you're creating properties, it needs to be 2 acres. You need to have 90 feet along the public street. They require buildings to be set back at least 65 feet from the road. And then they have a 25-foot setback from the side property line, rear property line. So that's to create, different communities will set different setback distances depending on the kind of the character of development they want to see, and how much space they want to see between dwellings, how much space between the road and the building. And then there are general standards too. And so these apply town-wide. So how many parking spaces do you need for retail use, for example? Do you want to have design requirements for signs? And then you can have standards too on noise, lighting, and emissions. So those are kind of the basic building blocks of zoning bylaws. In the next few slides, I'm going to talk about just some different, more specific things you can do with zoning under state law. So you can also develop historic districts and design control districts. So historic districts, those would be set up and you have specific design criteria. So those are common. If you have in a historic village area and you're looking to maintain the character of that village, you can establish a historic district. And then if there's any new construction or remodeling that's happening, a property owner would need to meet certain standards to maintain the historic quality of that neighborhood. Design control districts are similar, but they don't have to be in a historic district. So you could have a design control district to maintain certain architectural requirements, but it doesn't need to be historic properties necessarily. So one example, the town of Wilmington in Windham County they have both a historic design review district and village design review district in their downtown. So that historic district covers the core of downtown Wilmington, and then the village design review district covers the outskirts of it. But that's kind of an example of an overlay zone with additional requirements. I also wanted to mention, there's some new approaches to zoning that towns have been working on in the last 10 to 15 years or so. So when Vermont enacted zoning in 1931, that's really when zoning went into effect in most places in the country around that time. And in 1931, things were very different. It's almost 100 years ago. And at that time, the main reason why zoning was put into place was trying to separate uses that are not compatible with one another. So if you can think about, this was a time when cities were developing, you had a lot of industrial uses that were impacting residential properties, and the main focus was on, we need to separate out industrial uses from residential properties. So we're gonna create zoning, we're gonna create different districts across the town and make sure residential uses are in one area, commercial uses are in another area, and they're not impacting one another. And that worked for that period of time. Things changed where we don't have as many of those heavy industrial uses, so that incompatibility of uses is less of an issue. And most times when you're talking about what a community wants to accomplish with its zoning, it wants to, similar to Guilford, it wants to preserve its character and keep the characteristics of the community that help define Guilford. And so a lot of the focus is more on, what development and buildings look like, how properties are landscaped, things like that. And so there is this new approach to zoning that I just wanted to mention called form-based zoning, form-based code. And this is an example just taken from Shelburne, Vermont's form-based code. And there's more emphasis on, a little hard to see, but kind of the character of development. So you have, images of this is, the type of architectural design we want to see in this district. You have more illustrative drawings of how a building can be set out on a property. You might have a requirement that a building has to be built to a certain line to try to keep that building line along a street frontage. You might have requirements too about planting trees in front of the building along certain roads. And then there's also requirements about, you can have requirements about how the building walls are designed, how the roofs are designed, things like that. And form-based codes, I think more often they are done for just a small area of a town. So for like a village area, for example, if you really want to protect the design and character of a village area, that type of approach might make sense. Some towns do it town-wide, but I think it makes more sense in a smaller area in a community. And then I just wanted to mention this project too. This was a project done back in 2006 in the town of Putney. It's called Visualizing Density. So this was just a project in Putney Village. So those that are familiar with Putney, and I live in Putney, so I'm very familiar. So this is the Putney Food Co-op there. This is Route 5 coming into Putney. So this was a project that was done by Windham Regional Commission with the town, and they were looking at the current zoning in the community. Putney had zoning in place at that time, and trying to understand, okay, based on your current regulations, what types of buildings could you build here? And then working with the community, trying to come up with more of a vision of, this is what you could do here, what do you want to see here? And this was kind of the result of that community planning process, where this was more the type of development the community wanted to see. And then this project said, to achieve this, these are the changes you need to make to your zoning. So I share this because I think in thinking about zoning, it can be helpful to go through this type of kind of community design process to think about what does the community want to see, and then work on regulations based on that, especially if you're working, like in the case of Putney, in a very small, small village area with a lot of historic character and wanting to maintain that, but also wanting to see more development and more housing opportunities. So I think this is just an example of what one town did to do some of that additional community planning before making changes to their zoning. So that is a very quick overview of zoning. So I'll talk about subdivision next. I have a lot fewer slides on subdivision regulations. So for subdivision, these regulations control the pattern of development. So if you have a 10-acre piece of land, if a town has subdivision regulations in place, that's going to tell you how you can divide up that piece of land. And the importance of subdivision regulations is you're ensuring that property owners are creating conforming lots that fit in with the other properties around them, so that you don't have a case of kind of odd-shaped lots that might be hard to develop in the future, that might not take into account historic development patterns. Also, you want to make sure that when people are dividing up land, that they have adequate access to public roads, considering emergency service response requirements. It's also a chance to make sure that there's adequate water and wastewater, either if that's public systems or on-site systems. You can also use subdivision regulations to protect important natural, cultural, and scenic resources too. And it's most effective when zoning and subdivision are working together. But there are towns in our region that just have subdivision regulations and don't have zoning. But they're more effective hand in hand. And so I wanted to share just a map. This is another map from the Guilford Town Plan. This is the natural resources map. And sorry, okay, my slides got mixed up. So I'm going to go to this slide and then I'll go back to that slide. So one approach that we promote to subdivision regulations is a conservation subdivision model. So this allows for the same number of homes to be built on a smaller area of land. So just as an example, this is the existing landscape here on the left-hand side. And there's an existing farm operation. Just for the purpose of this presentation, say that's a 100-acre piece of land. So if that's a 100-acre piece of land, let's say the town has a 10-acre minimum zoning. So if you're going to subdivide that 100 acres, your lots need to be at least 10 acres in size. So you could have this where you just have 10-acre pieces of land. You're just chopping up that entire piece of farmland. But conservation subdivision says, okay, we're gonna, instead of doing that, you can still build 10 homes, but instead of 10 homes on 10 acres of land, we're gonna do 10 homes, and each of those are on 2 acres of land, for a total of 20 acres, and then the rest of the 80 acres is gonna be conserved. And it could be conserved for farmland. You can also do this to conserve important natural resources areas. So someone who's looking to build homes still gets to build 10 homes, but you're protecting important natural resources or agricultural land at the same time. And this is a good approach too, because it's also, if you're constructing, if you're needing to extend a public road to service that subdivision, that's less public road that you're building, so you're reducing town costs in the long run. So I'll just jump back to this one, the natural resources map from the Guilford Town Plan. So this map identifies important natural resources in the town. Many of these identified and mapped out by the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Environmental Conservation. And when thinking about a conservation subdivision approach to subdivision regulations, I know the town also completed a natural resources inventory. This is kind of the data you can use if someone's doing that type of subdivision to regulate how that happens and where development occurs, to make sure that you're protecting some of these important natural resources areas. On its own, the natural resources map from the town plan, the natural resources inventory, those documents on their own aren't necessarily going to protect these natural resources. The state, depending on what you're doing, the state has permitting requirements too. But these regulations allow for additional control and protection of these natural resources area. And then this is kind of a scary map here. This is just one last thing I wanted to share about subdivisions before turning to non-regulatory tools. So this is, we call this a measles map. This is also in the town of Marlborough. And this is just showing a hypothetical development based on current zoning and subdivision regulations for the town of Marlborough. This was done a few years ago. So each of the red dots on the screen represent a hypothetical dwelling unit that could be built under current zoning. Now, I will say this does not take into account topography or anything like that. So this actually, this could not happen, I recognize that. But this is purely just looking at total land area, how things are zoned. And if you literally divided up the town based on the subdivision regulations and zoning, you would have houses across the entire town of Marlborough. But why I share this is that when you're if any town is pursuing zoning and subdivision regulations, it's really important to think about how that's actually gonna be built out across the town. So I think in developing zoning, I always tell towns, be careful what you zone for, because that's what you're gonna get. So I think towns can put in place land use regulations and then be surprised at what happens. So I think it's really careful in developing land use regulations to not just take a zoning bylaw from Marlborough and adopt that. I think you need to think about what makes sense for your community. And I think it can be hard to think about what, if you have a minimum lot size of 2 acres, what does that look like? And so this is kind of an exercise you can go through. Like that's what it would look like, and is that what you want to see or not? So, so this is more of just a cautionary tale. So the next few slides, I did want to talk about non-regulatory tools that towns use. I think it's important to keep in mind that there are things a town can do and that Guilford's already doing to promote development and investment in parts of town and to steer development in certain areas. So these obviously can be done in conjunction with land use regulations, but they can also be done on their own. So the big one is public infrastructure and facility investments. So where a town is investing money in terms of roads, in terms of, for example, rehabilitating this building, making investments in your villages, in sidewalks, the extension of utilities into Algiers Village, that opens up development opportunities that didn't exist before. How a town invests in recreational and community facilities. New residents are looking for those types of recreational and community facilities. If the town is making those investments, you're going to be able to attract more development. If those investments aren't made, you might not be able to. So there are ways that towns can influence how development occurs and where it occurs just based on where they're investing money. And so a town's budget is a really important tool for trying to encourage the type of development you want to see and where you want to see it. Towns can also purchase or accept development rights. So often these are done in the form of a conservation easement. So you might have a property owner that wants to conserve land that has important natural resources or agricultural lands, and towns can accept those development rights. And that's a way to restrict future development on property. That can be done kind of in coordination or partnership with a land trust, for example, like Vermont Land Trust, or other entities can also work with the town, understand what the town's priorities are for conservation, and try to work with property owners to conserve those lands. There's also additional planning work that can be done in creating advisory committees. So towns can create, select boards can create advisory committees to look at any number of things. Often we see housing, historic preservation, conservation, economic development committees form. And these groups can do additional planning work and advise select boards on policies and projects that a select board might want to pursue. Towns can do village master plans to kind of similar to the visualizing density project that Putney did, to come up with a plan, an idea for how you want to see village areas or other areas of your town develop over time. That doesn't have the same power as regulatory tools, but it provides a vision for what the community wants to see. There's the state designation program, which I know both Algiers and Guilford Center are designated village centers under the state designation program, and that provides tax credits for rehabilitating historic structures. So that's another way to help preserve that local character, is doing the state designation program process. You can support local businesses. You know, some towns, Town of Putney has a local tourism initiative. You know, some towns offer just small scale storefront improvement grants to help businesses make some of those improvements to their properties. Anyway, that's another way to invest in the community that doesn't require land use regulations. So I just wanted to talk quickly, because I know it's something that comes up a lot, just when we talk about land use regulations, is the role of the state. And I won't go into great detail just because both Act 250 and Section 248 are very complicated permitting processes. But I think it's important to keep in mind, and folks might be familiar with this, but just quickly, so for Act 250, so that's the state land use and development law, that's managed by the Natural Resources Board. So it provides a process for reviewing environmental, social, and fiscal impacts of major developments and subdivisions. And then Section 248 is the Public Utilities Commission process. So that's for approving electric generation and transmission facilities. So how Act 250 relates to local land use regulations. So if you're a town with zoning and subdivision, so it's both of those two things need to be in place. Act 250 only comes into effect if it's a subdivision of 10 or more lots. So if you're taking one piece of land and creating 10 or more lots, that triggers Act 250. And if it's a commercial development on more than 10 acres of land, that also requires Act 250 review. If you're a town without zoning and subdivision, it's a lower threshold, so it's a subdivision of 6 lots or more, or commercial development on only 1 acre of land. And that's just the land area that the commercial property is on has to be more than 1 acre of land. And then there are some additional standards that are applicable to all towns. So state or municipal projects on more than 10 acres of land, housing projects for 10 or more units, communications, cellular towers that are greater than 50 feet, any projects that are over 2,500 feet in elevation. And then if you're changing an Act 250 permit or a substantial change to a pre-1970 project. And there are, I think, well, I was going to turn to this. I'm not going to go into detail on all these criteria, but these are the criteria that are reviewed in the Act 250 process. And one thing I want to highlight is that in the Act 250 process, a lot of the focus of their review is on the impact development has on these things. So they're looking at what impact does this development have on air and water pollution, water supply, erosion and capacity of soil to hold water, transportation, educational services, town services, aesthetic, scenic, natural beauty, the cumulative impact of growth, and they're also looking at consistency with local and regional plans. But their review is, like I said, it's on the impacts on these things. So it doesn't include, Act 250 doesn't have the standards like building setback requirements or building height requirements. So where it's beneficial to have those local land use regulations is you provide a lot more specificity about what you want to see the development to look like. And the Act 250 review is being done by the state versus being under local control. And I think from my perspective, that's another benefit of having local land use regulations is it's controlled by the municipality. Act 250 still comes into play depending on the size of the project, but there is more local control. And I just have here highlighted that, they are looking at local and regional plans. So they are, for Act 250 applications, they would be looking at the Guilford Town Plan to see how does this project fit in with what's spelled out in the Guilford Town Plan. But I think, like I said, I think the local control is can be lost without those regulations. And I think that was my last slide. So with that, happy to take any questions, and if there's anyone on Zoom too. But,
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that probably, maybe 25 years ago, I was actually, as the arts and culture representative to the Windham Regional Commission, and I was at one of these presentations that was done, and they showed that very measles map of Marlboro, and they showed what struck me at that moment was they were demonstrating what local planning can do, and they had a map of what Putney looked like now, like one of those zoning maps, and a map of what Putney could look like using its zoning. And when you got done, it looked like Putney still. You could see Putney. I did. Then they showed what Marlboro looks like now, and then they showed the means map of what Marlboro could look like with its current zoning at that moment. And I think it's different now. But it was really struck me about how to maintain the bones of a community was done so well. It was really clear to me that Putney had thought about how to shape their community to protect those central bones. And Marlboro's zoning at that time, or lack of zoning probably at that time, would allow anything to happen in the community. That was really struck me at that point.
Yeah, we should probably update that. Measles map, I think it's been around for many years.
I have a question. You talked about investing in infrastructure, and I'm thinking, I won't name towns to shame them, but there are many towns that have the infrastructure, but still don't have the economic development. So what other factors are at play that we should be aware of?
That's a good question. So I think with all this, with land use regulations, you can create zoning bylaws for kind of an ideal development scenario that you want to see, but it still takes the private sector to come in and actually build something. So I think you can have the infrastructure in place, but there might just not be the demand to take advantage of that, to do new development or rehabilitation of buildings. So I think having infrastructure that like water and wastewater infrastructure is really important to develop housing at certain levels of density to allow housing to be more affordable. Because as you increase density, cost per unit goes down and it makes a project more feasible. But that infrastructure is also important for commercial properties, especially for restaurant uses, things like that have a lot of wastewater. Having a public system is really important for that. So I guess to answer your question, I think it's still important to come up with land use regulations for what you want to see, but keeping in mind this development happens in the private, like it's private development that happens. So you kind of have to, the development incentive needs to be there.
There's so much demand in Vermont for new housing or land to build on, and it's so many more people want to build than can afford to. is there anything in your presentation that addresses the cost of new housing besides, density?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think there are a lot of things that are driving housing costs, and right now, it's very expensive to build in Vermont. I think some ways that zoning can help bring down housing costs is through just making sure you have lot size requirements that are not, like, for example, I'll take a step back. I mean, you need to keep in mind how you want to see your community develop. I mean, if there are areas you want to see conserved, you should certainly have larger lot zoning requirements in those areas, but areas where you want to see development where it's suitable, having smaller lot sizes that still allow for a private septic system, still allow for a well on that property, but smaller lots, half-acre lots, 1-acre lots, rather than 2-acre or 3-acre minimums, because the cost of land it is a factor in the cost of housing. I think that's kind of the big one. Is just making sure that you're not requiring properties that are larger than they need to be. Yeah.
That makes me think of how in Vernon, they also don't have much in the way of zoning. They have some, I think, but they don't have public utilities either, and they have one housing development that a private company built for workers that have a shared septic system for an entire neighborhood.
Yeah. So you can do that as well, and there are plenty of examples of that. And I think there are examples of just like a single multifamily residential property with an on-site septic system. Like in those cases, the challenge is you often need more land to accommodate that septic system versus if you're connecting to a public system. So that can be a challenge just because you need enough land, you need the right soils, and there are fewer properties that can fit that. But there are examples too of residential subdivisions where there is a shared wastewater system, and that can help with just reducing how much land each individual property needs. So rather than having 20 homes with their own systems, if you could create a communal system that serves 20 properties, that might be a way to just do it more efficiently, but each property owner needing less land. So it's doable. It's hard, especially when you're talking about larger residential developments where it's like 20, 30, 40 units. You need a very large wastewater system to accommodate that. So I think it's more feasible for smaller, like 8, 10 units, but it is doable.
I wonder if it would be feasible for an 8 to 10 unit. Like if a spot of land in Guilford could be identified that would be appropriate, the soil, the water, and everything around it to be developed.
Yeah.
Then it almost makes sense to kind of put a bunch of units, not a bunch, out here would be, 10 would be a bunch.
Right.
On one system.
Yeah. Good.
Hi. Sometimes I hear the concerns of folks in our town and other towns where there isn't zoning, like Guilford, if there were to be a change in zoning, they have concerns about the value of their land, depreciating. And either depreciating or what they could possibly, do with their land. So I'm just wondering, and then I just know that I've been involved in this project, and we had to go through the Act 250 process, which was just, if we had had zoning in town, we wouldn't, because it wasn't a change of use in this building, it's really because we had to put in a leach field. So it was a real eye-opener for me, about that. But I'm just curious if, you can talk about, addressing that, are there scenarios where, having zoning in a town could increase somebody's property value, or it's examples I think are helpful for all of us to to kind of begin to wrap our heads around it, because we have, I think for some people, we haven't had zoning and things feel fine, and then but what it does happen is when there's suddenly a project coming into play, and then we don't have zoning, and people are concerned whether it's here or another town, and that's often when people get engaged. So I think going back to our original question, the concerns that people have about that zoning would change, what they own and what they could do with it.
Yeah, so I completely understand that concern. I think one of the benefits of having zoning is it provides some predictability in terms of what's going to happen on the properties around you. So I think I understand the concerns about zoning restricting how someone can use their property, but it also puts some safeguards in place to make sure that a neighboring property isn't going to do something that you might not be too excited about and might impact your property values. So it provides that kind of guarantee about what could happen in your neighborhood. And I think I can't say how that contributes to property values, but I think that's a benefit of it. I'm trying to think. I think what can be challenging is if you don't have those regulations in place and something is proposed, you can be limited in terms of what you can do as a community if you don't have regulations in place. And then it's, I was saying, it can be kind of too late.
Yeah, because I just want to share, in Vermont, there was a recent thing that this came up, and there was a proposal, that an application for someone to use their land in Vermont to bring contaminated soils, which is something that all of us, if we're taking a house down, there are contaminated soils and things that happen in projects, right? But the community was upset because, the Agency of Natural Resources came into the hearing and that they were being told, well, because you don't have zoning, you don't have any say. And that felt really pretty crummy to some people, right?
Yeah.
And then that is part of the reality, I guess. And ultimately, they were not granted the permit because there were some real concerns about contamination of water systems that were in the area. But, those were kind of the scary scenarios, I guess, that a lot of people would feel about. And then, I think we have a lot of farming families in town and who are concerned about, they've worked the land for a long time and have a deep relationship with the land. And they kind of don't want to, what I heard, people don't want to be told what to do.
Yeah.
So, do you think I'd love to hear some other communities, how they navigated this or how they decided to do it.
Yeah, and I think, so one of the challenges can be is if you're creating zoning for the first time, or if you have zoning and you're changing zoning, is you can create properties that are non-conforming. And so that just means, that property, it could be any number of reasons, is not in conformance with the zoning bylaws. And then if someone's coming in to try to do something, that may mean that that it's more difficult for them to do that because their property maybe it's too small, or their home is located too close to a front property line and they're looking to do an addition and it doesn't conform with the zoning. So that happens a lot just because coming up with any zoning code, it's kind of impossible to think about all the different scenarios. It's a very hard puzzle to figure out. So there are, under state statute, you can, it's called a waiver process. There's also a variance process. And they're different. Not to get into too much detail, but the variance process is a little more difficult, and the state defines what you need to meet to get a variance, but the waiver process can be done at the local level, and so the town can kind of decide, under these circumstances, we're going to give the property owner a waiver and let them build that addition, as long as these conditions are met. So there are safety valves in zoning to allow people to still do what they want to do with their properties. But I think it's important. It's a trade-off. I mean, I think there will be situations where someone would like to do something, and if a town has zoning, they're not able to do it under the zoning. And there is that process they can go through, but it's also not a good idea to just grant waivers and variances to allow everyone to do what they want to do, because then why have zoning if you're just creating exceptions? But it is a trade-off. So it's not to say that you can have zoning and everyone's still going to be able to do what they want to do. But it's kind of it's a judgment call, a decision a community needs to make. Is that a trade-off we want to make? Go ahead. Yeah.
Is there like state guidelines that you have to adhere to, or can you do it minimal, or as a town, can you set up your own, or is it like state?
So there are state guidelines. So there are minimum standards, and there are in state statute. And I'm not going to be able to recall all of them, but there are requirements in terms of there are certain uses that you can't restrict them. Like, you need to allow for certain types of uses in your town. But generally, towns do have a lot of flexibility in developing their zoning. And I think the town of Halifax has zoning bylaws. I think their zoning bylaws are 50 pages long or so, 40 to 50 pages. And then you could have a community like South Burlington, Vermont, and I think, their zoning is hundreds of pages long. So there are minimum things you need to do. But I think, a town that, thinking about zoning, there is a way to approach it with starting off with the minimum standards, and kind of adjusting to that and then making changes. But it's important to keep in mind, under state statute, Vermont is a state where you can only do what the state allows you to do with zoning. Some states are different, where as long as the state doesn't say you can't do that, then towns have more freedom. But Vermont is a state where it is more specific. And so in developing zoning, you would need to follow those state statutes.
So I think it's fair to say that I think what you're talking about following state guidance is not just specific to zoning.
Mm-hmm.
It's about every aspect of our government.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Towns aren't free to just go off and do their own thing.
Yeah.
No town in Vermont is. We're all banded together under the state of Vermont.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
As you're saying, as far as the guidelines of state statutes, as far as if we were to pursue, like, say, really light zoning, one of those statutes people, we still need like a zoning administrator, we need a paid official, right?
Yeah, and that's a challenge for a lot of small towns is, right, if you're gonna have zoning in place, you need someone to administer it, to interpret the zoning and to issue permits, and you need either a zoning board or a development review board to receive applications and make decisions. So that's,
Does Halifax has that?
So and I'm not sure, there are towns, so every town that has zoning needs to have a zoning administrator. There are towns where, the town manager is also the zoning administrator. There are towns that have just a zoning administrator. A lot of them are part-time. Is there
any scenarios where like towns share administrators?
Yeah, I'm trying to think in our region. I know there are definitely examples in the state of shared zoning administrators, which is, I think, a good approach, because especially in smaller towns, there aren't that many permits to process, so it's really not a full-time job. But if you can combine with one other town or two other towns, it's the challenge too of, because it's not a full-time job, it can be hard to find someone to fill it. If you're just hiring a person just to serve one community versus 2 or 3 communities, where maybe there's enough work between 2 or 3 communities to make it a full-time job. So I think, I would, if it's something that gets pursued, I think trying to share those resources. I think there are lots of areas where towns can share resources more. So, yeah. Let's see. I think you go ahead, sir. Yeah.
All of this makes me think back to a very serious discussion back in the 1970s about whether we ought to have zoning and anticipating changes. And the decision was that we probably had enough regulation and we didn't go with zoning, we haven't yet. At some point, back 40 years ago or something, I can remember a very concerned discussion in the planning commission about the fact that there were going to be increases in population and younger people coming into the town with lots of children, and the impact on our school was going to be overwhelming. And how do we plan for that, and how do we control it, and do we need to have some idea? And I can remember Emory Evans, who was on the planning commission with me back in those days, saying, well, let's just watch it for a while and see what happens. Well, looking at it from where we are at the moment, nothing's happened. Basically, Guilford's the same size as it was then. The school is under some pressure, but the pressures that the school is under are not from huge numbers of youngsters coming in. And I'm okay, so the other side of things, I do listen to the news. The subways in New York are flooding. The sea level is rising. All of these people in New Jersey and whatnot are going to have to go someplace. And they may very well come up 91. And we're basically off of the first exit. And a lot of people are looking at our green mountains as the country's burning, and they're saying to themselves, maybe this would be a really good place to invest. And I know we have. 3 people have built houses within a very short distance of my house in Guilford Center, and I know that things are changing. I just hear Henry saying, let's watch it for a while and see what happens.
It's hard. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a crystal ball to know what's going to happen. And to your point too, I didn't cover it much in this presentation, but there are multiple layers of regulations out there too at the state level that are regulating land use development and how that happens. And that's not to discount that, you pretend that's not happening, because that's also controlling how development occurs, and simple things too, like in our region, there are very few towns that have community wastewater and water systems. And so if you need to do an on-site septic and you need a well to build a house, if there are topography issues, if the soils aren't right, it's actually limiting where that can happen naturally. So it's hard to cover kind of all the things that come together to either allow development or not, and how it occurs. But there's a lot of regulation too at the state level that's affecting this. But I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Unfortunately, I wish I did. But yeah, go ahead.
One of your slides said something about a town, when the town is choosing to invest in itself, purchase or accept rights of development or rights or conservation easements. That was very interesting to me, because I think the divide right now in Guilford is how to protect these pastures and farmlands from being developed. If they're developable, we don't really know if they are or not, but we don't want them to be. So conservation easements or the other thing you said about conservation was that type of zoning where you conserve the field and then the houses on the edge or whatever.
Yeah, so I think, right, to protect open agricultural fields, I mean, through zoning, I think in the Marlboro example I showed, they, and I don't know the specifics of it, but they had kind of an agricultural zoning district. And so through land use regulations, you could have larger minimum lot size requirements. You could kind of require the clustering of housing if it was developed through
What was that, like the town can accept the rights?
Yeah, so that,
Conservation easements?
so a town, and it's, and this kind of, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to explain this in great detail, but for both, lands that have important natural resources and for agricultural lands, there's a process to conserve important agricultural areas or natural resources through a conservation easement, and that the conservation easement, the property owner still owns the land, but the easement is just saying on this portion of land, we're restricting development, so no development can occur in the future. And that is just applied to whatever area has that land of value. And then the property owner can benefit because they're basically giving away their development rights. And there are tax implications and tax benefits from that. Most often it's a land trust that would work with a property owner and compensate that property owner too for that conservation easement.
The property owner maybe can't afford to keep the land, doesn't want to see it developed, doesn't want to sell it.
Right.
So it comes to the town and says, look, can you help me preserve this field for the future use? And then I don't want to pay property taxes on it anymore. And the town of Guilford can continue looking at this beautiful pasture. And
I think it would be worthwhile, because this is I'll be honest, it's an area in planning I'm less familiar with it. I know Vernon has an agricultural land protection program that the town, I believe the town manages. So that's one example of a local town that has that. More often it's through a land trust, a nonprofit land trust, rather than a municipality. But there needs to be, it's not to say that because land trusts too, they have limited funding, so they need to prioritize what land they want to conserve. So it's not that they're going to be able to preserve every piece of farmland. So there needs to be, it needs to kind of fit with the land trust's goals and mission too, just because they have limited resources. Yeah.
How does that conservation development model affect the town's income through personal property tax?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how that would.
So I'm wondering, piggybacking off your question, is it most when the chunk of land goes into preservation, is it still a private property owner for the most part, or a nonprofit, and they're still paying personal property taxes, or is it mostly the state that's conserving the land?
Yeah,
And then the town doesn't get an income from that?
Yeah.
I could change the rate. I would just say that's kind of something that like the Vermont Land Trust is really expert at. It's not really, I think that's why you're someone right, but it's not really something that planning commissions do. There are lots of different models for it right now.
There would be implications, but I don't know what the specifics, and it's one of those trade-offs too, where towns, when towns are thinking about, their property tax base, they need to be concerned about that, but there's also a goal maybe of protecting farmland, and so there's a trade-off. So if it has an impact on property tax base, but they're able to conserve and afford a piece of farmland. Yeah, but I don't know the specifics, but.
Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. And in thinking about land use regulations, there's so many things to consider. And almost like playing three-dimensional chess, it seems like. And what resources are available to towns who are thinking about drafting bylaws, like either through Windham Regional or for VLCT, that can help people make smart decisions? Because you have that one house on 2 acres, you get with measles map, but if you're like Putney and have a really thoughtful plan, you can, as Don said, preserve the bones of community. So again, for towns who are like thinking about this, what resources are available to assist?
Well, I know there are a lot of resources. The state has a lot of resources. The Department of Housing and Community Development, their website has good resources. There are a lot of helpful planning manuals, Vermont planning manuals that are out there that provide more information about zoning generally and different approaches, and I can provide links to those for the Planning Commission to look at. We're happy to continue to talk to the Planning Commission about just follow up with additional questions and next steps. The process of developing zoning bylaws is a lot more time consuming, and so the state has a municipal planning grant program, and that's something where funding is made available each year. And one thing that you can fund through that is developing zoning bylaws or amending zoning bylaws. And this year, I think the grant was up to $30,000. So you could hire a consultant or Windham Regional to actually write the zoning bylaws. But there are a lot of resources out there just to continue the conversation and think about it more. But that actually drafting the bylaws is a big step.
What's the impact on low-income people by having to adhere to special zoning things plus pay, for permits and all that stuff that is not now?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about with zoning. Like I was saying, there are different approaches. So there are communities that may decide to have very specific design standards for how you design a home, for example. You don't have to do that, but something like that would definitely have implications on just the cost of building a home or remodeling a home. You don't have to have those types of regulations. You can keep it more basic, just saying these are the uses that are allowed and these are setback requirements. For permitting, it is kind of up to the town how they want to, like the rates they want to set. So it's important to have some type of fee for zoning permits. It helps pay for the administrator that's administering it, but it's kind of a decision for the town to make how high those rates should be. Generally in this area, they're usually pretty low. Just understanding that you don't want to charge your residents a lot to just do basic home remodeling and additions, but there would be probably a fee with it. I think you have your hand up.
My sense is that there would be a disproportionate effect on big tracts of farmland that have been passed down to the center, to the generations, versus me, who just has a little house on 2 acres of land. So zoning's not really going to affect me all that much. But, my heart goes out to people with the big tracts of land. It sounds as though if we put it in zoning, their choices would be greatly limited as to what they could do. And this is a disproportionate effect, I think.
Yeah, and I think I think it depends, it would depend on how the town would, if the town had zoning, it would, depend on how they want to zone that property and the type of, those farmland properties and what they want to allow to happen there. But I understand your point.
There would have to be a great deal of respect in what was decided to do with
Yeah.
this.
Yeah,
So I just want, could you just describe, or maybe quickly, I get the notion of a town deciding to do zoning, just to address the question, which this town has done a number of times.
Yeah.
Then once a town does have zoning, there are certain requirements for zoning district and so forth.
Yeah.
What's the process for actually creating the zoning? Who gets to do that? Is that a select board responsibility? Is it a planning commission responsibility? Are there charrettes that are done by the entire town to build that? Who makes the decisions on that kind of thing?
Good question. So it's the planning, under statute, the planning commission is responsible for developing zoning bylaws, but it's the select board that adopts them. So it's,
Sorry.
So, but it's important for there to be collaboration, for there to be support for moving forward between the select board and the planning commission, and because developing zoning from scratch does require funding, and that's the select board. So the select board would need to decide to fund the project, so they need to be supportive of it. But to your question too about the development process is, it kind of depends on the approach the community wants to take. So I think, like as I said, the town plan and zoning needs to be consistent. So I know that town just went through a town planning process. You're going through the strategic planning process. There are already conversations happening. So I think having additional conversations would be helpful. But I think it's kind of up to the community how you want to do that. But I think community engagement and doing those kind of design charrettes and getting buy-in is really important.
It seems to me that if the town were interested in encouraging commercial development, industrial development, or lots of affordable housing, it would be very important to consider where we would want this and how to control it. And zoning is certainly one way of doing that. I'm not picking up a great desire in the community for putting in a lot of affordable housing. In certain ways, I think that there is interest in finding places for other people to live and stay in their community. That discussion's been going on for 30 years. I haven't, now that I'm of that age, I guess I understand it. But there isn't, I don't feel that drive for making changes that would require zoning.
Yeah, so I think zoning can be like forward-looking and trying to attract certain types of uses to make it clear, we as a community have zoned this area for industrial, we're supportive of it, we've zoned it that way. I do think zoning is helpful to, I think a lot of the development we've seen in Vermont, especially in the last, 40, 50 years, is this incremental a lot of residential development on large pieces of land, where I think it can be hard to appreciate the impact because it's happened over a long period of time. But we do see that kind of residential sprawl where we're just kind of slowly but surely moving further out and doing 5-acre, 10-acre properties. And so I think zoning can be helpful too to try to accomplish that goal of focusing development more around our villages and requiring that important areas are conserved by requiring larger lot zoning. So you're kind of discouraging that type of development, I think. So I think it can help in that more addressing that slow-paced development that you don't really notice as much.
Yes, smart development.
Yeah.
Right? Just like thinking about it as far as, instead of this kind of like sprawl and fragmentation, where it's having more of a sense of where development's happening. I had a question about, as far as when, kind of a nuts and bolts thing, but it just, as far as like, when, even in a town with no zoning, if someone puts in a house, you're required by the state to have a septic system.
Yeah.
How is that oversight done? Like, is there any oversight? Like, because I know technically you're supposed to, and you have an engineer that does that. But I would just kind of like, is there really any?
There is.
Yes.
You built the house.
Okay,
For septic and
Yeah.
the whole system, yeah.
Yeah.
You have to have an engineer that's willing to sign off on it. For.
Yeah.
Did someone come and?
Yeah.
Say, really?
Whole plan, pretty expensive
Yeah.
to do the plan and the filing.
Yeah. Did you ever hand up yet?
No.
Okay.
By restricting, which, I mean, I don't like to see house, but by restricting where only large parcels of land can be, isn't that restricting who can actually afford that? So, so basically it's encouraging people with money to have that, and then discouraging people that can only afford 5 to 10 acres from putting a house in, or 2 acres, or, you know.
And I think, I think there's a way to do it where, in those areas you really want to conserve, towns. I've seen towns use the current use program that the state has, where you can qualify for tax benefits if you have a certain number of acres of land under forestry or agriculture. I think it's 25 acres, and then so a lot of towns will have 27-acre minimum lot size requirements for conservation areas. And I think that I totally agree with your point where I would not encourage a town from creating zoning that makes certain areas only affordable for wealthier individuals. And I think there's a way to have variation in your zoning. So you have, 27-acre minimum lot sizes for those conservation areas, but then still allow like reasonable lot sizes in other areas of town, so that you're meeting the needs of different residents and families that are looking to stay in the community or move into the community. I think that's a very good point too, where if you're just creating large lot size requirements, someone is going to be able to afford to come in and buy a 25-acre piece of land, but
I think all of us know people who wanted to live in Guilford and who would have been great people to have in our community, like our videographer here, Austin. And, there was just nothing to buy. And I also know from my time here that Guilford is deeply, don't tread on me, you know? And I would love to see us try to create a way that we can accommodate the next generations. I mean, if farm families want to, let's say, have their next generation maybe have a house close to, their other house and try to keep the land open, then, I have great respect and affection for the people who are persevering here, keeping the land open. And I also would really dislike I don't have a prejudice against people from away. In 1968, I was a person from away, and I came here and gradually put down roots. But I'd really like to find a way that the kids who grew up here, who wanted to stay, that we could aim toward that, or kids who grew up here and went off to seek their fortunes and wanted to come back, that we could somehow value those connections, even though, that's an emotional thing rather than fairness, like how anybody could just start out and come to a place. I see it in all different frames, and I don't have an answer to how to fill in even one of those frames.
Yeah, 20 years ago, I was on the planning commission, and we worked closely with Windham Regional Commission to draft a land use regulation for the town. We spent about 5 years on it, and it was simply standards-based. There was no zones. There was nothing to tell you how you could subdivide or couldn't subdivide. It was really a series of standards about setbacks and lighting and noise, things that were, affected butters. And, went to a vote, I think in 2010. I called your uncle-in-law, Dick Clark, the next day to see how the vote went, Dolores. He said, well, it went down in flames, and which it did. And I think, for a number of reasons, but I think part of it was people, didn't like the idea of having to pay for a permit, getting a permit, and then having to pay for a permit to do something that they could have done for free. Who knew the cost of the permit wasn't going to be that great, but it was something new, and it was a burden. So that's the story of the last time that we went through this.
I kind of was thinking what Brand was saying, but about I've definitely seen in kind of wealthier communities that where young folks have a hard time purchasing property and stuff, where I've seen towns that have purchased property and then have had they've kind of raffled off plots of land with 100-year leases and things like that. So make it in a way. I mean, I assume that would involve lots of money from the town that could do something like that.
Yeah, but there are those other approaches. Towns can control development and the type of development. Towns can buy pieces of property, and then they can do an RFP process and say, we want this type of development here, and hire a developer to do it. But it is costly. It's costly. So it's there are other strategies too.
And then just on Rick's point too is I think this is just a really great conversation in the community we're having, being able to discuss this in a simple manner, and definitely with being on the planning commission, I would love to see more of this. Like, I don't see anything happening without, like, the community involvement and having it happen. And I definitely wouldn't want to spend a lot of time on something that the community wasn't supportive of. So I really, just a comment, appreciate you being here answering these questions, and appreciate everyone else that was here today that kind of participated in a civil manner in this.
So, one thing I'd just like to comment on, what you were talking about a little bit earlier. I mean, the fact that Guilford has essentially stayed like it has been for so many years. But there are communities, and this is not to place fear in Guilford or anything, but it's a reality. Not very far from here, there are communities who literally almost doubled in size in the last 5 years because of whatever. Things have changed in their lives. COVID has one school district not too far from here, their school system had 100 kids normally, and next year it had 160. I mean, that's a monstrous change. That could happen here in Guilford. Again, it's not to put fear, but the world is changing pretty fast, and in some ways, maybe differently than it did in the last 50 years. I don't know. It seems like it's worth at least continuing the conversation, like Jeffrey says, because I think things are coming.
Well, I remember Henry saying, let's watch and see what's happening.
So you're the new Emily.
I was doing that.
Well, one thing that I appreciate hearing tonight is that I think you hear the word zoning and you have this concept of this monolithic, one size fits all. I think what I really appreciate hearing tonight is that there's a great degree of customization that can build in respect for farming communities, can be used as a tool to really preserve. I love that example. If you have a 100-acre parcel and you put the houses on one end, and that's going to be much more respective of the land, the natural resources, and not fragment. I mean, to Andy's point about one of the things the Conservation Commission has, I think, illustrated beautifully is that if you start building these homes on 10-acre parcels on the hillsides, you've really fragmented habitat. And so if you try to think about conserving not only Guilford's character, but also its natural resources, being thoughtful can help preserve. And once you cut down a forest plot, you're not going to get that back. So I think to wait and see what happens. Well, once you finally realize that habitat's being destroyed, it's too late to take action. So it's not an easy process. I mean, trying to do this well sounds very challenging. But I also feel like I always sort of see this almost as like a legacy, that Putney had the vision years ago to create a legacy for the future, and now it's bearing fruit.
You know, I just kind of want to say the patently obvious. I think that from what I'm hearing, we retain the greatest control locally if we create our own playbook. Otherwise, something else may come into play. And, you know, we recently had an experience here where there were neighbors that didn't want something to happen. And then, thank goodness for them, they were saved by the next level up that came into play. But it was through no planning on our part or their part. And, you know, that 100-acre plot, Dolores, that you're talking about, that could be for sale. You know, the whole thing. And it's still going to be the rich guy or person that gets it. And it may be the rich developer that gets it, and we have nothing in place to stop that person, except what's above it. That, you know, it's more than 10 acres and 250 will come in.
And the town is involved in the Act 250 process, but it's a different entity that's evaluating the impact of that project on your community versus a local zoning board or development review board or planning commission that's doing that, made up of Guilford residents. yeah, I think there's a lot of value in that.
It's getting late. I want to thank Matt for spending over